Hey, what's up, everybody? Good afternoon and welcome back. Hope you've had a good week. We are getting snow again. I swear it's always snowing, and we're always shoveling and always moving cars. So, if you're in California and without power, or dealing with forest fires, or trapped inside because of lockdowns, you don't have snow. But I think that honestly, your situation is still much worse than ours. So, I empathize with you. I am glad, though, that you're here with us today. We're still discussing clientelism, and this is such a neat discussion because it's, one of the features of politics that's more unseemly. And politics in general is unseemly, and it's been called organized crime, and it is because what you do politically, you do with the power of the state. But when we talk about clientelism, we're often talking about using state resources to purchase votes or to buy the support of voters. And that obviously has really important implications for democracy. And when we talk about clientelism, then we have to talk about how clientelistic relationships undercut or even maybe strengthen democracy. And believe it or not, both of those perspectives are are at hand when we talk about clientelism. And you'll see in a moment that one perspective on clientelism is that it's just part of politics and that it's a stage in democratic politics that all democratic countries will experience and go through. And we can talk about and wrestle with those issues when we come up against them here in a moment. But thank you for being here, and thank you for as always showing up ready to go. It's good to see all of you. Welcome back. Let's get started. I actually want to begin in the Philippines. This is a place we haven't been, but it's a place where clientelism is a problem. And let's take a look at a video that highlights the relationships between party brokers and voters. And remember that the party or the politician or the broker, if you will, is sort of like the principal. The client, the voter, is the individual whose support is being purchased or being bought, so to speak. And so these relationships involve different types of actors, and really the brokers themselves only represent the party. When we talk about who's working on behalf of political parties, it's usually multiple levels of middlemen who do this work. So let's focus on those relationships in this video before we come back.
It's illegal to buy and sell votes. But for many years, this has been the norm in Philippine elections.
In-experience ko na rin yan, yung pagkatapos bumoto, simple ka abutan.
Sabi-sabi lang punta tayo doon, meron daw dito abutan, mga ganon. Yung iba kasi katira, pera na yan eh. Hindi man nila alam kung sino yung boto ko. Tanggap lang sila ng tanggap.
For 2 decades now, politicians have been hiring Juan as POC leader, in charge of buying votes for them. On the night before election day, POC leaders go to a known bailiwick of their patron's opponent. They pay voters there 1,000 pesos each to stay home and not vote.
Kakausapin na kung ilan yung botante sa pamilya nila. O, kung ilang kayong botante rito, huwag na lang kayong bumoto, babayaran na lang namin kayo. Kasi alam namin na ang iboboto nila yung kalaban namin.
On election day, POC leaders tell voters to go to a specified place before casting their ballot. Their names are listed down before they are given instructions on what to do. At the precinct, voters must discreetly show their failed ballot to the watcher, who is also hired by Juan's candidate.
Kahit nga minsan yung mga teachers, alam, may ano rin yan, nabibigyan. Tapos pagdating nung pag nakaboto ka na, may indelible ka na, pupunta ka na ulit sa lugar na, sa kapabayaran.
Those who vote for Juan's client, a candidate for mayor, get 1,000 pesos. Watchers are paid 300 pesos to make sure voters deliver on their promise. Watchers are also required to vote for Juan's candidate.
Pag nanalo yung kandidato mo, pwede kang maging empleyado ngayon ng munisipyo. Matatanggap ka agad kasi nakatulong ka na.
Juan doesn't think there's anything wrong with what he does.
Kung hindi namin gagawin yun, kalaban lang namin ang gagawa. No, tinatapatan lang namin na
CNN Philippines talked to some people who admit to selling their votes or say they know, quote, someone who does.
Sa sobrang sigong kahirapan, di ba? Kailangan ng pera. Lalo na yung mga mahirap, madali mabibili. Pera din po yun ng bayan. Di po ba? Hindi naman po galing sa bulsa nila yun eh.
A 2018 study by the Ateneo School of Government shows about 40% witnessed vote buying in their community, while 20% admitted to actually selling their votes. Of those who admitted to selling their votes, 2 of 3 said they voted for the candidate who gave them money.
Kung tumanggap ka ng pera, kailangan mo din talaga silang iboto. Kawawa naman din kasi.
Ronald Mendoza, Dean of the Ateneo School of Government, says vote buying is more rampant in areas where the battle among candidates is neck and neck.
I think actually vote buying decides who wins in those intensely competitive areas.
Mendoza notes many Filipinos sell their votes not just because of poverty. They do it because they have lost their faith in democracy and would rather think of their own benefits first rather than the country.
Pero kung maling tao ang ilagay natin dyan, the possibility is that they will begin to rationalize, oh, because I spent so much getting elected, then I must somehow get that back. And it's okay to get that back because sa akin din naman ang takbo nyo eh.
During elections, all Filipino voters stand on equal footing. All of us, rich or poor, the influential and the powerless, get.
So everyone's getting paid, from the top down. It's not just the voters whose vote is being purchased. It's also the watchers. And then, of course, the individuals hired by the politicians or by the party. And so there are multiple layers, and there are a variety of different actors, and everyone is getting paid as part of this. And this is the case in the Philippines, but it's also the case in Mexico. It's the case in Brazil. It's the case in a lot of Asian and Latin American countries where democracy is still relatively new in many cases, and where there are very competitive elections, but where parties take advantage of lots of poor people by purchasing their votes and engaging in this clientelism that we've talked about. And so we'll talk about in a moment how widespread this is, and we'll even take a look at whether and how clientelism may have played a role in US politics at an early stage of the development of the United States democracy. And we'll consider whether clientelism is just sort of like something that all democracies experience, or if there's something that's especially destructive about it and that is unique in new democracies. The question, though, that comes up for many of you, I'm sure, if you're thinking critically especially, is, what actually differentiates this clientelism from other democratic exchanges? Aren't politicians already in the business of basically trading policies or practices for votes? What separates clientelistic transfers from other kinds of democratic exchanges? How do we know one from the other? And I'm glad that you would ask, because this is the important question. It is true that all politicians are engaged in trading policies for votes, and they're trying to get people to vote for them. And so they want to satisfy them in ways that mean something for voters. But what differentiates clientelistic exchanges is that the goods in the transfers are private. And that is to say that they really only benefit a select few, a subset of a larger group. And not just that, the transfers themselves are discretionary. And that is to say that it's at the discretion or the decision or the whim of the politician or the party, and specifically in a way that implies a threat of exclusion. And so you're transferring what are effectively private goods, that is, goods that are turned over to a select few and that are designed to benefit a select few within a larger group. And you're doing so in a way that is discretionary and that it implies a threat of exclusion should those individuals not vote for you or support you or reciprocate or pay it back or pay it forward, so to speak, upon receiving that support. So it's an exchange that is premised upon the threat of exclusion and that benefits only a select or a partial few out of a larger group. And this is what differentiates it from public goods. Public goods are those public goods or those goods that are transferred as part of a larger program or some larger policy. This is a transfer that benefits everyone. And the nature of a public good is that it's universal, meaning everyone can use it essentially as much as they need to without anyone becoming less capable of using that good. The idea is that there are no sort of discretionary exclusions. The goods are public, enjoyed by everyone, and they benefit everyone. And there's no threat of exclusion attached to the transfer of those goods. It's not like, you only get the good if you vote for this candidate or if you support this party. No, it's a public good because it's a policy or a rule that everyone benefits from that good. And so a bridge, or a waterway or a public grazing land or a road or a school or a public library, air we breathe, water we drink, electricity we use, these are all examples of public goods. But a chicken that is given to you in exchange for your vote, or a 5-pound bag of rice, or 1,000 pesos given to you in exchange for your vote, but not given to someone else who belongs to a different party, that is a clientelistic transfer. That is a private good that is designed to benefit a narrow select few and contingent upon them providing some support, lest they be excluded from receiving that good in the future. And so public versus private goods is really the distinction that becomes essential when we talk about clientelistic transfers versus democratic exchanges. And to make this more concrete, let me give you an example of a public good that is different than the kind of private good that we saw in the video in the Philippines and the videos from the case of Mexico. In that example that I want to give you is the example of Bolsa Familia, which is a conditional cash transfer program in Brazil. This is an example of a public good, but it's nevertheless one that does involve transfers. And so in a sense, you can think of this as a type of transfer, but a type of transfer that is different than a non-programmatic clientelistic transfer. This is by definition, a programmatic public policy or a public good. It is a transfer that is enjoyed by all within that public group, so long as they meet the conditional transfer requirements set out in the policy. And so Bolsa Familia is a conditional cash transfer program that basically provides families with an allowance for sending their children to school. And parents have to meet a certain level of need. And basically it goes to poor families. Now in Brazil, a large proportion of the population is poor, as much as a fourth or a third of the population is in poverty. And so that's a large proportion of the population who qualify for the program. But nevertheless, everyone within that group of the public that qualifies gets the benefit, and they get the allowance as long as they send their children to school. And the way it works is, if you send your child to school and you can demonstrate good attendance, the state will give you a cash bonus each month. And the reason that they do this is because A, they want to increase literacy and school attendance rates among poor families, and B, they want to reduce rates of child labor. And poor families, especially in rural areas in Brazil, often put their children to work as one more way of generating income for the family. This is a way of both eradicating poverty as well as educating children in Brazil. And consequently, Bolsa Familia can be understood and thought of as really a public good program, a program based upon programmatic transfers of public goods, not in the slightest private or based upon some threat of exclusion. Now, the politics of public goods in the politics of Bolsa Familia also highlight the way in which public goods function differently than those private goods that are based upon the threat of exclusion that we associate with clientelism. And so the best example of this in the Brazilian case is the way in which Lula da Silva, who is a former president of the Brazilian uh, from the Brazilian Workers' Party, his support in his 2006 reelection owed a lot to Bolsa Familia. And so in the same way that clientelistic transfers can help to build support for a candidate or a party, so too can programmatic transfers and public goods transfers build support for a party. It's just that the difference is that these are programmatic exchanges that don't carry a threat of exclusion. And in the case of Brazil, Bolsa Familia was actually quite important in helping to shift the Workers' Party and Lula himself, his voting base, to more underdeveloped regions in Brazil. And so Bolsa Familia became important because it was a way of enfranchising poorer citizens who both voted at lower rates and had children that were less educated with lower rates of literacy and higher rates of child labor. And so public goods become quite important in politics. And they become important in politics in the way that clientelistic transfers can become important as well. It's just that public goods and public transfers function differently because they don't carry that threat of exclusion. And it's important for us to understand that there's a very big difference between public and private goods and clientelistic versus programmatic transfers. And so take a look at Bolsa Familia. Take a look at this. A fourth of the total population of Brazil is currently enrolled in the program. Clientelistic transfers don't cover that proportion of the population. They are, by their very definition, narrow and particularistic, and they are targeted to specific groups within the larger public group. And it would never be the case that this large of a proportion of the population was enrolled in a clientelistic, non-programmatic exchange program of the kind that we saw in the videos from Mexico and in the Philippines. 50 million enrolled, 14 million families. It is a huge social welfare program, and it is one that we can conceive of in terms of public goods targeted on promoting specific political, economic, and social objectives. The objective of the Bolsa Familia program is to increase literacy and reduce child labor and expand the purchasing power of poor families. Those objectives are, of course, good politically for the Workers' Party and for those political parties and candidates who are associated with Bolsa Familia. And those benefits can for sure help to let the Workers' Party survive in office. But these policies are different than clientelistic policies because they really involve delivering public goods that more indirectly will carry political benefits for certain parties. Clientelistic exchanges, on the other hand, are not designed to promote public objectives. They are chiefly designed to link voters and parties and voters and politicians in a reciprocal exchange that will lead to the survival of the politician and the party, not necessarily the promotion of literacy and in the purchasing power of families. And so you begin to see some of the differences. Let's take a look at the experience of a family in Brazil who benefits from the Bolsa Familia program. And I want you to pay attention to the kind of good provided to the family and the circumstances and the context surrounding this transfer. And I want you to pay especially close attention to the absence of parties or politicians in this picture. There's a great deal of distance between the recipient and the sender, and the resender, of course, is the state under the control of the Workers' Party. But remember that our Mexico case study highlighted the close link between the party and the voter. In this video, you'll see the absence of that link. And that's another way that we can begin to distinguish between clientelistic transfers and public goods transfers.
In this tiny house in one of Rio's favelas, Tanya, her husband, and their 4 children are scraping by. With no education and no steady job, they're used to living hand to mouth. But for the last 3 years, life has been a bit easier, thanks to one of President Lula's main domestic programs, a monthly stipend known as the Bolsa Familia, granted to Brazil's poorest families.
The Bolsa is good for us, but also for lots of other people. It helps us have more purchasing power.
This family gets just under $80 each month. It may not seem like much, but it covers the basics.
We buy things that the kids like cookies, vegetables, and fruits.
And school supplies.
Yes, that too. It helps us a lot.
To be eligible for the $40 to $120 stipend, families have to meet certain conditions. Children between the ages of 6 and 15 must go to school, and the youngest must be vaccinated. The Bolsa's detractors say that it will keep people on the dole, but the program's popularity means it's likely to stick around. None of the presidential candidates are against it, and there's even talk of expanding the program. But recipients like Tanya say to really fight poverty, more than money is needed.
What's important is education. They should give those of us who haven't had any education the possibility to study, so there would be less poverty in Brazil. There would be fewer people who need the Bolsa Familia.
The World Bank is planning to loan Brazil 200 million euros to expand the Bolsa, a welcome relief for families struggling to survive in one of the countries with the greatest economic inequality in the world.
So notice the requirements for the program aren't, you must vote for the Workers' Party, you must vote for Lula. There's no enforced reciprocation where you've got to prove or establish how or who you voted for or that you didn't vote. None of that is part of this. It's a public program that involves, meeting certain requirements regarding income and et cetera. And those are the requirements that get you the benefits. And so, whereas in the case of Mexico in the PRI, where we saw this direct exchange, money for votes, in the case of Bolsa Familia, clearly those who benefit from the program may ultimately vote for the Workers' Party, but the requirement for receiving the benefit is not, you must vote for the party. It's important, but a small and possibly easy to miss difference. In the past, I remember having a discussion with someone who argued that, well, all democratic politics is clientelistic. All policies designed to redistribute income or wealth, it's all clientelistic. You're purchasing the loyalty or the support of voters, but you're really not. You're really not. It is true that parties and politicians might benefit. They might get more support when they push through policies that help people who need the money. But it's different when you are paying them for their vote. It is part of an informal exchange where the agreement is to continue receiving this money, you must continue voting for the party. And so it is an important difference, not just a distinction. And so to hammer this out and to really clarify this for you, let's just put it in the clearest, simplest possible language. Unlike Bolsa Familia, which favors the public as a whole, clientelism favors specific groups of actors or specific constituencies within constituencies. And what this means is that elites must reward specific supporters, and to do so, they potentially steal or use valuable state resources to do that. And this can be a drain on state resources as well as a misallocation of valuable resources. And really, it amounts to stealing from the many to benefit the few. And to the extent that public resources are used to do this, the situation is even worse. And it begins to really erode or potentially undermine not just democratic politics and relationships between politicians and voters, but it also begins to undermine the state in the capacity of the state to perform functions and provide public goods. When you begin to sort of balkanize the distribution of public goods in this way, and constituencies within constituencies become the specific groups of actors, you begin to undermine the delivery of public goods. And the situation that results is a patchwork of a state, and it's a mishmash of public and private goods. And the state doesn't develop its essential functions that way. And there's also the potential that relationships of accountability can break down, and that voters can lose the ability to hold parties and politicians to account if those parties and politicians can control them through the purchasing of their vote or their support, and especially if they need that money or those resources that are transferred to them informally and privately as part of the clientelistic exchange. Now, listen, there's always a disagreement in a debate to be had about any issue that we discuss. Nothing is ever super simple and straightforward and easy to clarify. We can make arguments about the benefits as well as the drawbacks of clientelism. And one individual who has taken a, a nuanced position on this is Francis Fukuyama. And that's who we're looking at right here. And we're going to watch a video where he talks about clientelism and the role of clientelism in new democracies and what it really does. And pay close attention to his rendering and his sort of presentation of the issue. And I want you to focus on ultimately, what is his view of clientelism? Does he view it as negative or does he view it positively? And in a moment, we'll step back and we'll think about how clientelism impacts democratic accountability and some of the other considerations that matter to us in a class like this.
Note, now, clientelism is I would say, a feature of virtually every poor democracy that has ever existed in the world. So if you go to Brazil or Mexico or Indonesia or India, clientelism and the associated forms of corruption are practiced very broadly. This is how political machines get ordinary voters to vote for them. I, however, would argue that it should not be regarded as a pure form of corruption, where comparable to, say, an education minister pocketing, $50 million and just putting it in a bank account in Switzerland for the benefit of his family. Because clientelism actually does involve a reciprocal exchange of favors, so that the politician actually has to give something back to the voters, even if it is, in effect, an individual bribe. So there is a degree of reciprocity. And I think what I'm going to argue is that clientelism actually arose and should be more properly regarded not simply as a form of corruption, but as an early stage of democratic mobilization. That in societies with low levels of education and wealth, that this is actually the most efficient way to get people to the polls, because most voters in such societies actually aren't, they don't care about global warming or, trade talks with Japan or, kinds of public policy issues that more developed countries worry about. They worry about, am I going to have food on the table for my family? And if the politician can give them the Christmas turkey or the get out of jail card for their cousin or whatever, that's the basis on which they're gonna vote. And we tend to look down on countries with these clientelistic systems and say, well, they just don't understand how a proper democracy, that you're supposed to vote on programmatic issues for candidates that lay out, general public policy positions and define themselves more by ideology and less by these personal exchange of favors. But we don't understand that this is exactly the way that American politics worked through the better part of the 19th century. So here starts the history lesson. So if you look at what the American government looked like in the years after the signing of the Constitution, the ratification of the Constitution, you could describe it basically as government by the friends of George Washington, meaning that the federal government, to the extent that it existed at all, there were mostly customs inspectors, some postmasters, some leaders of local militias, this sort of thing. To the extent that it existed at all, most of the leaders were actually elites of that time, and a lot of them graduates of places like Harvard and Yale and Princeton. But the principle of equality was deeply embedded in the Declaration of Independence, and the United States was one of the first countries in the world to open up the franchise, and many states began to do this in the 1820s. And the critical election was really the election of 1828 that brought Andrew Jackson to power, because this was the first election in which a majority of states voted, with a universal male franchise. This is really the first country anywhere in the world that implemented a universal male franchise. And this led to the need, first of all, for political parties, because all of a sudden, instead of these elite factions, and that's basically what the Federalist Party was, you had these new parties that had to come into being in order to get people to the polls. And there was this recognition that the easiest way to motivate people to vote was actually to bribe them individually. So in the 1828 election, it featured Andrew Jackson against John Quincy Adams. This was a classic polarity in American politics. John Quincy Adams was a Harvard graduate. He had traveled in Europe. He could speak many European languages. His father was the second president of the United States, so a classic Boston Brahmin. Andrew Jackson was a frontiersman. He was a Scotch-Irish, brawler, drinker, Indian fighter. He had almost no formal education. He made his name fighting the Cherokee and Seminoles, drove the Seminoles out of northern Florida, won the Battle of New Orleans, and as a result of his military successes, ran for president and won in 1828. And when he won, he said two things. He said, first of all, I won the election, so I should get to choose who runs the US government. And second, he didn't put it quite in these terms, but he said, it doesn't take a genius to run the American government. And this was a period in which, the average level of education in the United States was probably somewhere, third or fourth grade. I mean, it wasn't even, you couldn't, at this point, not even a majority of Americans even had an elementary school education. And so that meant that if an ordinary American was put in a position of postmaster, customs official, or so forth, they didn't have a whole lot of skill. And this inaugurates this period that is alternatively known as the spoils system or the patronage system that lasts for about 100 years in American history. And with every passing year after the 1828 election, both the emerging Democratic and Republican parties begin to use this as a means of voter mobilization, so that by the time of the Civil War, virtually every appointed official from the federal government all the way down to local postmasters and Indian reservation managers were all there as a result of a payoff by a politician to some political supporter. And if you read Abraham Lincoln, particularly after he was reelected in 1864, he is just in tears and tearing his hair out at the fact that he has got to deal day after day after day with office seekers who say, I supported you in the election, so you owe me a job, and what are you gonna give me? And in fact, a lot of the early battles that the Union lost was because Lincoln felt compelled to appoint people like Dan Sickles or other political generals who were essentially politicians that could, bring political support in an election, but were completely incompetent military leaders. And it's really only as the war dragged on at huge cost that he realized that merit was actually an important principle for recruiting a general. And that's, finally, it took him several years to find Ulysses Grant and promote him to the top. And this is really the system that existed in the United States into the second half of the 19th century. Okay, so that's the first part of the American.
So that's Fukuyama on clientelism. And I just want to isolate on one part of his video in his dialogue here. He says clientelism is how politicians get ordinary voters to vote for them. It is a reciprocal exchange of favors. The politician actually has to give something back to the voters. And it's interesting because Fukuyama views this exchange in a relatively sort of kind of functional way, right? And it's almost as if clientelism as part of democracy can help to promote democracy and can help to establish that linkage between individual voters and the larger political system that we've talked about throughout our discussions in this class. But I want to ask you, what do you think about Fukuyama's view of clientelism? Do you think that this statement is accurate? Do you agree with this? Do you think that clientelism is more complicated, or that maybe Fukuyama is missing something? Is there more to the story? Is he doing a disservice presenting clientelism in this way? What do you think?
I feel like, while I understand voter apathy is a real problem, I don't think Fukuyama's historical example in particular was an accurate way of representing clientelism in the present and the sort of downsides of it. How he's talking about how generals wanted jobs through the patronage system still requires that these people have to get others to vote in an election, because it's not just the patrons who get the jobs in the government that are going to create an electoral majority. So I feel like that sort of reciprocal exchange defeats the purpose of what democracy is supposed to be. If you're voting for someone, the point of a democratic society is that he is supposed to reflect your values in some capacity. If the only thing you get from your party is a turkey every time elections come up, that's not democracy. That's just the worst aspect of a welfare state.
Okay. There's a lot there that's really useful for us, and I'm going to try to go piece by piece, but I want to hear from as many people as possible. But first, Ishan pointed out, first and foremost, the situations aren't really comparable. Obviously today, there are still examples of people who get put in positions because they bankrolled the campaign, right? Betsy DeVos had no experience in education and was put in charge of the education department, primarily because she was interested in voucherizing public schools, and that had to do with her economic interests. So that is clearly something that still takes place. Ishan points out that the question of purchasing votes is sort of something different, right? That's happening at a much more individual and grassroots level, where you're intervening in the relationships between parties and voters and politicians and voters, and you're introducing this very this very kind of primitive monetary element most of the time, right? You're paying them, you're giving them a turkey. And then that final point that Ishan made, what about the quality or the sort of characteristics of or the substance of that accountability? What kind of accountability is that if all you're getting from your elected official is a turkey? Is that accountability in the strictest sense of the term? Does that promote democracy? Are we able to exert control over our elected officials if all we're able to do is compel them to give us a turkey or a bag of weed or some beer or 1,000 pesos or whatever it is that they give us? And maybe Fukuyama is missing this, right? Maybe he's sort of doing a disservice in the way that he presents clientelism in this way. What the rest of y'all think? Let's talk about this. Let's talk about this further. Ishan says, I was about to say Betsy DeVos. She's the poster child. I can't think of a better example, although there are many examples. So I want to set you up to answer this in a more precise way. Those of you who might be thinking about this and unsure how to approach it, or hesitant to speak up or comment. You know, when we talk about political behavior and accountability, we're talking about really the strength of the democracy, right? One thing that we want out of democracy is accountability. We want to be able to exert control over parties and politicians, and we want institutions of democracy to be able to exert control over each other. Now, with regard to accountability, does clientelism increase accountability or does it reduce accountability in your view? Tell me in the chat. So does clientelism promote accountability or does it undermine accountability? Yeah, it's
undermine.
okay. Harjis, do you want to talk a little bit about why?
Sorry, I was talking. I realized my mic was muted. So, basically, just because the examples that we watched, and it just showcases that, like, how do I explain it? It's like it doesn't show accountability just because it's like, I don't know how to put it to words. It's like, because it's not really, I don't know how to explain it, but it undermines accountability for sure. Like from what I've seen through the videos and like the examples that you gave us.
Yeah, so this is a tough question, everybody, and I know it's hard, but these questions help us to think about the implications. And when we say accountability, what we mean is, and as you're all sort of pointing out correctly, it really means like our ability to exert control over politicians, right? Like, can we control them or influence their survival politically? Are we able to do that? Can we vote them out? But as Alex points out, we might not be able to vote them out if accountability is reduced to clientelistic exchanges. And the reason is because, as Alex says, you already got paid at the start. So what does it matter what happens afterwards? That's a great point. Here's another possibility. If the extent of the relationship and if the extent of the accountability is, did you give me my turkey or not? Well, that's a pretty low bar for the politician or the party to cross, right? say they give you your turkey, and then what? Are they just able to just line their pockets and take everything? Well, a clientelistic exchange theoretically would confine the relationship to that. And that is one way that clientelism becomes problematic, because when the political relationship revolves around that exchange, there's a lot else that can happen in that the party or the politician can do and sort of have permission to get away with once they've satisfied those clientelistic expectations. And so clearly accountability is undermined, right? You're letting them get away with murder because they gave you some weed or some beer, or they gave you 1,000 pesos. I don't mean to cheapen it, but this is really what it often comes down to. I had a conversation with one of my best friends, and he's a professor in Chile, and he laughed. He said, it's terrible. You give these people a chicken, and that's all they need to vote for the party or the politician. And when you can give them a chicken and you can get their support, what else can you get away with, assuming you've given them that chicken, right? And so that accountability goes out the window, and we're no longer exerting that control that we would associate with democracy. And so many of you are all over this, suggesting that it reduces accountability. Ernie says it puts you in a tough spot, to say the least. I would agree. Oscar says, I think that these politicians are not held accountable by clientelism, because if they make mistakes during their time in office, at the end of the day, they would still get the people's vote, because the people would still receive, the sort of metaphorical turkey, and they would not vote based on the performance of the politicians. Therefore, it's not promoting democracy if the people are not participating for their own will and for their own interest. Yeah, touche, right? If the criteria for evaluating the performance of the candidate or the party is whether they gave you, a small amount of money or a bag of rice, well, you're obviously not evaluating them in terms of their performance in economic policy or their human rights record, and so on and so forth. Alondra says, it promotes accountability only when it benefits the actors involved. So maybe that's a more nuanced way of putting it, right? Like maybe we can hold them accountable, but only to the extent that we're able to point out that they didn't give us the money that they said they would give us, or that, we expect or demand a certain exchange or a certain good or something in return for our vote. And Carlos points out that it affects accountability because votes are not earned through performance. Yeah, so as you're pointing out, whereas with economic voting, we vote based upon an evaluation of the performance or the future performance of a candidate, with clientelistic voting, we're voting based upon an evaluation or an assessment of whether they have sufficiently bought us off. And that clearly is a distortion of those criteria that we would normally consider, and it's far from economic voting. Zeri says, I think it might undermine accountability in some aspects. For example, the video on clientelism in the Philippines, individuals knew clientelism wasn't necessarily a good thing, but at that point, it's such a norm in their country that they had no hope for democracy, and they were just looking to vote for self-interest. Yeah, as the video said, at that point, people sort of have lost faith that democracy will work anyway. And so they're willing to be bought off by parties and politicians. But, to what extent is their dissatisfaction with democracy itself a product of clientelism? Does democracy not work in the first place because of the clientelism? And so, accepting and entering into clientelistic relationships with parties and politicians because democracy doesn't work, well, that's kind of like saying, I broke this pan, so I'll stop using pans because pans break. You broke the pan, right? You contributed or entered into this clientelistic relationship that has helped to undermine democracy. And so you begin to see, though, that these relationships can feed on themselves, and poverty remains a problem when politicians and parties can simply obtain the support of the poor by paying them off, and not necessarily by, making investments or making policy decisions that would provide public goods that could actually substantially improve their condition, like the Bolsa Familia program in Brazil. Anna Gabrielle says, I agree with Oscar. Based on the videos, most people are voting to acquire resources, not so much because they actually care about the policies being presented. People are pretty much voting out of necessity. Yeah, it's like an economic consideration, not as in like, evaluating their performance, but evaluating, your basic survival, and in making a decision based on whether they can give you something in the short term that would change that. Alex says, but I feel like there has to be a limit, right? Well, I don't know. I don't know what the limit is. Is there a bottom to that barrel? It's well known that in a lot of countries, parties both steal public resources to do this, and get most of their support, from from paying off poor people, buying their vote. So I don't know where that limit is. In the places like the Philippines, India, Brazil, Mexico, it's a big problem. Indonesia, clientelism is a big problem. The point that I want to make to you, and what I'd like us to conclude with, is that clientelistic relationships do represent one linkage strategy, but it's not a programmatic linkage strategy, and it's not a linkage strategy that promotes democracy, generally speaking. It is a functional way. It is a way to connect politicians and parties to voters, but it's not a way that is likely to consolidate or deepen democracy. And so all of these approaches to voting tell us a little bit something different. They tell us something different about voting in relationships between parties and politicians and voters. And clientelism and economic voting and partisan voting are not created equal in that regard, even though they all reflect a little bit differently on the motivations of voters. I think at the end of the day, if we're able to distinguish between partisan voting and economic voting, we should also be able to distinguish between clientelistic voting and economic voting. They're obviously similar in some ways, but clearly very different as well. The last thing I want to say is I'll read Anna Gabrielle's comment, which is interesting and nuanced. I understand Fukuyama's logic regarding clientelism increasing voter participation, but I don't feel it's a stable approach. Politicians are rewarding people to guarantee their positions and uphold power. What guarantees that once people begin to pay attention and participate in politics, politicians won't participate in voter suppression to continue upholding their positions if they don't agree with the decisions voters make? I would agree that it's not a stable approach. And even if it functions and works to incorporate people at some stage, it's not a lasting and sustainable way of connecting parties to voters. And I think ultimately it's going to undermine both the state and the democracy, because it wastes resources and it tends to sever relationships of accountability between voters and parties and politicians. So that's going to conclude our discussion for today, everybody. We stayed a little bit after. I'm sorry about that. But thanks for being here, and I'll see you on Monday. Chicken.